I was one of the, if I may say so, co-authors of the Agenda for Change. 1.5 years ago, I was in charge of doing the green paper process, which eventually led to drafting the Agenda for Change. So I consider myself very much committed intellectually and also in terms of its practical implications. The question for me now is whether this conceptual framework has a meaningful relevance for a country like South Sudan, and I think it does. If you look at the Agenda for Change, the major breakthrough is that we try to improve two important strands of development policy. The first being democratic governance, rule of law, and human rights. So the promotion of democratic governance strategies is a key element, and we were very much inspired by the Arab Spring events, which I think helped decision makers in Brussels and beyond to recognize the importance of democratic governance for sustainable development. And the other important change is that we very much believe in the promotion of inclusive and sustainable growth strategies. The notion of economic growth, which has to be inclusive and sustainable, very much at the forefront of development policymakers at this juncture. Within that context of inclusive growth, two important elements have to be taken into consideration. First being food security, rural development and agriculture as a major sector for ensuring that the problems in many developing countries can be resolved. And the second one being energy, access to energy, renewable energy. This is very important in the context of fighting climate change and adapting to the consequences. Now, all of these things are of tremendous importance in South Sudan. While it's one of the most fragile states in the world, it certainly needs both the democratic governance principles fully adopting and making sure that this is part of the development plan, and the inclusive growth agenda, because without growth you cannot actually distribute the benefits to the citizens. No, I think it's highly relevant. What is more challenging for us is the private sector involvement, which is one key driver to make this happen. And private sector involvement is difficult because we are at an infant stage in the development. We have to actually start from scratch in building a state and building a nation. So the civil society, non-state actors, civil society is very much at a sort of an infant stage there. And more sophisticated instruments such as innovative financing instruments or blending also have to come at a later stage. Although I think that subject now to a full accession to Cotonou, and President Salva Kiir has recently submitted his request to join Cotonou, it would be possible for us to make optimal use of the EU Africa Infrastructure Trust Fund facilities, which allow the mobilization of finance, international finance for large infrastructure projects, which is needed in a country which is landlocked, which has hardly any roads, which doesn't have interconnectivity in the region, and which of course needs all that to foster sustainable development. So there is lots of entry points for me in my daily work in South Sudan, but again we have to translate the conceptual framework into concrete operations. We have, as we speak, in the absence of a country strategy paper agreed with the government last year, because as you recall, I just said that they haven't acceded to the Cotonou Agreement yet. What we have done is we have decommitted 9th EDF development funds at a time when Sudan, meaning South Sudan and North Sudan, were still one country, when Sudan at that time was still party to the Cotonou Agreement. Now, Sudan, Khartoum, has not signed up to the revised Cotonou Agreement, as a result of which South Sudan, as the successor state in the south, wasn't party to the revised Cotonou Agreement. Now that led us to basically decommit 9th EDF funds, and of this amount, 285 million in 2010-2011, we have focused on 4 key sectors in full harmony with the National Development Plan 2011-2013 of the government of South Sudan. And these 4 sectors are rural development, healthcare, primary education, and rule of law, notably support to the judiciary. Now these four sectors very much respond to very much pressing needs in the country. In rural development, we very much focus on feeder roads and extension service to smallholder farmers. As I said, in healthcare, very much on primary healthcare, knowing that South Sudan has the highest infant mortality and maternity death rate in the world. 1 out of 9 children doesn't make it beyond its first birthday. It's terribly dramatic. It has one of the lowest primary school enrollment rates. And of course, rural development is also key because food insecurity is very much a problem. And rule of law, I mean, in any state wanting and wishing to build up its capacity, judiciary and legal reform needs to be a priority to ensure that that good governance becomes the heart of development efforts. Now, these 4 sectors have been fully discussed and agreed with the government. Now, the Agenda for Change stipulates that we can only do it in 3 sectors. But we had somehow to match the demand of the country. We can't simply say, you know, listen, we ignore, for instance, judiciary, we ignore primary health care. It's impossible for us. Because even if we have all the EU donors together and we represent the EU plus member states, 700 million for that 2 or 3 year period, it's still, you know, far short from what actually is needed there. And USAID is another important actor, and the Norwegians and the World Bank a bit, but still it falls short of actually addressing the developmental needs in this country. Once they have signed up to the Cotonou Agreement, and we hope that by July then this will be formalized, we would actually start the programming process of the multi-annual financial framework 2014-2020. Now this would be a whole new ball game, and we would of course then together with member states and other parties in the government, try to make sure that the Agenda for Change principles are fully adhered to. But we have to make sure, that's, I mean, a note of caution here, we have to make sure that an optimal division of labor and coordination at donor level actually takes place to ensure that the demand from the country is matched by the supply from the donor community. You can't afford that there are sort of areas or gray zones where there is no coverage. South Sudan is one of the pilot countries on joint programming. Now this is very much important for fragile states. We have decided at the beginning of last year to work closely with our member states, and as a matter of fact 11 member states and the EU together have developed a single EU country response strategy and have agreed on focusing on 5 key sectors. I already mentioned 4: rural development, healthcare, primary education, and judiciary and rule of law. And we added water. Water is very important because without water you can't sort of do agriculture, and you can't feed. You can't ensure that people have access to healthy drinking water, etc., etc. Now these 5 sectors basically guide our member states, the 11 member states plus the Commission and the EU at large, to focus its 700 million on these elements, which are priorities taken up in the National Development Plan. Now, this is still not enough. Joint programming was a success at member states and EU level, but it's not enough. Because if you look at other important donors, USAID, the Americans have the largest aid program in Africa, in South Sudan. So I think they are the single most important bilateral donor, but the EU at large, we are still ahead of them for the next 2 years. But still, together with the US Americans, we are the biggest one. The World Bank just started its engagement there with a more robust involvement, 75 million a year. African Development Bank is going to set up an office. Norwegians are a traditional donor there, of course. The Japanese are there. So there's a couple of important players. Plus you have all the humanitarian aid, right? We, for instance, we have mobilized last year 87 million, this year 45 million, member states another 50 million. So you also have to make sure that this famous linking relief, rehabilitation and development as a smooth transition from humanitarian to development work takes place, that we're bringing all the actors and players and instruments together. So joint programming is very much at the heart of this entire exercise, but we have to extend it beyond the EU scope to make sure that the government faces just one single interlocutor from the donor community. We already have to do our homework at the EU level, but that's not sufficient. We have to go beyond. And one of my key tasks is to promote this and make the EU speak with one single voice. But beyond that, act also in very close partnership with the others, the UN, the Americans, and the international financing institution.